My name's Orville Schell, and on behalf of Sidney Goldstein and Stephen Barclay at City Arts and Lectures, I would like to welcome you all here, those of you in the audience, as well as those who are listening over KQED over the live broadcast. I'd also like to welcome you on behalf of the Women's Foundation, which for 11 years now has funded projects and such things as child development training, after-school programs for children, shelters for homeless families, and the Women's Foundation will be the recipient of the proceeds from tonight's benefit. To introduce most presidents, former presidents, would be to risk becoming bogged down, I fear, in an endless string of platitudes. But fortunately, in President Carter's case, one has no such trouble. For me, anyway, during these last 2 decades, when the presidency has been demeaned by venality, dishonesty, and a tremendous amount of just plain muddle-headed thinking, I think you will all agree, President Carter has served as, I think, a really important reminder that a person of decency and who is civilized can still attain the highest office in the land. What has made Jimmy Carter such a venerable political figure, I think, is not only his accomplishments in the White House, but equally as important, his accomplishments since he left the office of the White House. And I must confess, I've always been rather perplexed by the benign neglect that fellow politicians, the press, and even we, the American people, have evinced towards President Carter after his term ended. He himself recently acknowledged with a certain wryness that once out of office, he said, "No one was begging for my presence." Actually, I think such neglect begs as many questions about our own contradictory yearnings for leaders of a mythic image, and our penchant as well for anointing them with misleading labels once they're in office or once they're out of office. And I was reminded by this way in which mythology rather than historical fact can color one's perceptions while preparing for this event, when I found myself feeling somewhat surprised upon reading his presidential memoir to discover the string of landmark accomplishments that actually was his while in office. The Camp David Accord, the Panama Canal Treaty, recognition of China, the SALT II Treaty, the Alaska National Interest Lands Act, the new energy bill, and lest we forget, bringing home the hostages from Iran, which as you may remember, was a hard-won victory that was accomplished only after the election, alas, and in fact in the very last day of President Carter's tenure in the White House. But I think it's heartening that there is a new wave of revisionist thinking about Carter that's finally started to crest, even causing some political observers to suggest that what President Carter accomplished in his 4 years in office surpasses what was accomplished in the ensuing 12 years of the presidency. And it may interest you to know that originally this event was scheduled for Herbst Theater, which seats about somewhere around 900 people, but due to its unexpected popularity, we are now here in Masonic Auditorium, where there are over 3,000 of you present. And I think all of your presence is testimony, I hope anyway, that President Carter's period of political exile is rapidly coming to an end. Will you please welcome President Jimmy Carter?
That's right.
Okay. Well, we don't want to give President Carter any withdrawal symptoms here of too sudden re-entry. I must say that this crowd begs the question of what is going on. How do you interpret this rather perfidious state of the American electorate?
Well, it's obvious that they've heard about the book, and they're just great. They're just experts on great literature. They want to.
I thought just to begin, I wanted to read something to you and get your reaction, because it in many ways summed up my own feelings about being with you here tonight. He was one of the most intelligent men ever to occupy the White House, and perhaps the hardest worker. A voracious student of domestic and foreign problems, intimately familiar with their minutest details, he was an efficient administrator who usually answered memorandums in writing the day he received them. At his frequent news conferences, he was knowledgeable, candid, even grammatical. Honestly self-searching, he was willing to confess error. He was the least imperial of presidents, a man of considerable moral courage, who often made great decisions largely on the merit of the case, as most Americans profess to believe a president always should. And yet, to some extent, therefore, the voters turned on James Earl Carter, Jr. in 1980 as if in a paroxysm of exasperation, and drove him from the office after only one term. This was written by Tom Wicker, as you may remember, in the New York Times.
No, I thought it was Rosalind at first. That's great.
But again, I think this raises the perplexing question of what happened that you, when you left office, somehow seemed to reach a nadir of what we may ascribe to a certain kind of image making.
Yes. Well, I think last year I was in office, the hostages being held in Iran was the obsessive issue in this country. And although, in retrospect, as a Monday morning quarterback, either I or other analysts haven't seen anything better we could do, since every hostage came home safe and free. There was still a sense in this country that somehow if I had been stronger, more forceful, more militaristic, if we had bombed Iran and destroyed Tehran and so forth, that would have been the macho thing to do. So I think there was an image of weakness there. And that combined with the commitment we made to human rights, which can be connoted as a symbol of weakness, and the fact that instead of sending American troops into troubled regions, we spent a lot of time negotiating peace agreements. So I think that there was a general sense that was exacerbated, obviously, in the campaign against then Governor Reagan, that we needed a stronger, leadership. Well, that's just one of the explanations. And of course, the Democratic Party was split. I was a fairly conservative leader on fiscal policy. I kept down the budget deficits and so forth. And no, I'm not trying to make myself look good, but there were elements in the Democratic Party that wanted me to spend lavishly and forget about, deficits and things like that. And I never was able to heal the wounds in the Democratic Party before the election. Those were two very important issues, I think.
One fact I was very interested to discover in reading, it must have been in one of your books, was that during your tenure, not a single American serviceman died in combat.
That's correct.
Your Secretary of Defense, Harold Brown, said something which I think may provoke us here a bit. He said that Americans associate agonized self-searching with a lack of leadership. Do you think this is true?
I think so. I remember that when we sent Marines into Beirut and bombed and shelled the little villages in the hills around Beirut, and then the Marines were killed with a terrorist attack. It was just a couple of days later that we invaded Grenada. And this is looked upon now by analysts as one of the great coups or achievements of President Reagan, that he took the American people's mind off the debacle in Lebanon, and with our extraordinary defeat of Grenada, redeemed the reputation of our country. And as a matter of fact, President Reagan gave 7,000 medals to our troops for that victory. But I think that unfortunately in our country, and maybe in some other countries too, not many, the best thing that a president can do to have an skyrocketing public opinion approval is to send troops into battle. And this was proven, I think, when we sent troops into Panama, killed 1,000 Panamanians, destroyed the country, when we defeated Grenada, when we sent troops into the Gulf War. I mean, this is a characteristic of our country that in the United States is looked upon as a great symbol of strength. But the Carter Center has programs all over the world in third world countries. We have programs in 26 African countries and a lot of Asian and Latin American countries. And in many nations, they look upon us as too quick to go to war, too quick to use our military might when maybe a peaceful settlement would be more difficult. But I think a clear indication of courage.
What does that say, however, about our capacity then to elect leaders who are reflective, who you constantly write in your books about sort of the agony of making the right decision, wrestling with that. And one has the feeling that very often no such wrestling match goes on in the White House.
Well, it goes in cycles. I have to say that my victory in 1976 was to a large degree a reaction against the Vietnam experience and a reaction against the lies that were told during Watergate and the revelations of crimes committed by the CIA. And when I would go around at first with just 15 or 20 people at the most in a crowd, I would say, I won't ever lie to you. If I ever make a misleading statement, don't vote for me. And I think the American people, at least in that phase of 1975-76, were really looking for someone who would tell the truth and deal with things in a non-combative way. But then it goes in cycles.
Well, does this mean that after you left office, the American public was ready to be lied to again?
I didn't say that. You said
it. You've also written about what you call a strong streak of primness in our values. And I was wondering, were you referring to yourself, to America? I think I know what you're talking about.
A strong streak
of primness.
Primness, oh yes. Well, I don't know. I think that is a human characteristic, to take a holier-than-thou self-appraisal. I'm a little bit better than others. Americans are better than foreigners. White people are better than black people. Anglos are better than Asians. Whatever I am is looked upon quite often as best, and I think that's a very serious defect, not only in Americans but in others. But we do think that in some ways, since we are so greatly blessed with rich, productive land and warm oceans and friendly neighbors and relative prosperity, this because we are somehow more deserving of God's blessing. And He sees in us a superiority that we ourselves have already assessed and is rewarding us for it.
Pride.
Sure, pride. So I think maybe pride and primness might be related in some way.
Because this raises an interesting question, which I think is a very American question, namely, and it particularly manifests itself in foreign policy, this sort of moralistic American streak. I mean, you don't find the French or the Germans or the Japanese seeing it as their burden to help other countries quite so readily, or even to assert their will in terms of things like human rights. To what do you ascribe this kind of uniquely American trait?
Well, I think the last answer would apply to that, too. We think that whatever we decide in America is basically right and is a political or ethical or moral standard that should be adopted by others if they want to be correct in their behavior. And I guess different leaders respond in different fashions. Sometimes, as I said earlier, our leaders respond with military action. If people don't comply with the way we want them to act, we invade. And we destroyed Nicaragua. I didn't mention that a while ago. We had 35,000 casualties in Nicaragua by supporting the Contras and by financing and orchestrating the so-called Contra War. And all that was not a war that was popular. It certainly did not adversely affect President Reagan's popularity to pursue it, even in illegal fashions. And so this inclination on the part of us in America to try to impose our will on others is something that maybe would respond to self-analysis, but I doubt it, because we are so blessed in many ways that this is almost proof that we're right.
Do you, in retrospect, look back on the balance of sort of the moral factor versus the realpolitik factor, and wonder if you had the balance right sometimes, or do you look back and say, well, I made some tough decisions and paid for them?
No, in a totally compatible way with what I've been talking. I think I was absolutely right. And
I rest my case. You've also written that you are a naturally shy person.
Yes.
And of course, it strikes me as odd that somebody who is naturally shy should have written himself quite so large and had to be in the public eye quite so much. And I wonder if that was a travail, or did you get used to it?
Both. That was a travail, and I got used to it. Rosalind was, I think, the shyest, most timid person I've ever known. When I first met her, the first few years of our marriage, all the way through my naval career, if we went to any sort of ship's party, Rosalind would sequester herself in the corner of the room and not want to talk to anyone. And she would caution me before we got there, Jimmy, don't leave me by myself. I don't want to confront people. And so it was extremely painful to Rosalind when she began to make speeches and hand out pamphlets for me at factory shift gates and so forth. And then I guess it's somewhat inherited. Amy is the same way. Amy is very shy. And when Amy began to be more activist as a college student, she was arrested 4 times, as a matter of fact. But
were you a proud father?
Well, I was. She was arrested 3 times demonstrating against apartheid in South Africa, and then the other time she was in Massachusetts demonstrating against what she thought and what I thought were illegal activities of the CIA in Nicaragua. And she and 10 others were arrested and put on trial. It took up almost a whole semester of her college work being on trial. But
did you get credit?
No, she didn't get credit. Well, in a way, she got credit with a jury. They had a 6-member jury, and Massachusetts has a very strange law that if you are guilty of a crime, in order to prevent a greater crime, then you are found innocent. And so Amy was found innocent because the crime that she committed, demonstrating and blocking a policeman's vehicle, was less of a crime than what the CIA was doing in Nicaragua. So she was, but the point I started to make was
sounds like Massachusetts.
Yeah, but she was always painfully ill at ease, I'm not exaggerating, in having to confront a news reporter or a TV camera, or even make a talk to another group of students. So I think the shyness is something that afflicts a lot of people. I know Lady Bird Johnson, even now, finds it almost impossible to get up before an audience and make a speech. She would not dream of making an impromptu 2-line speech. She reads but that's no reflection on her, because she's done wonderful things. So some people just don't like to confront an audience, and it used to be very difficult for me at first.
may I be so bold as to ask whether on an occasion like this you feel a faint flutter of nervousness, or?
Well, when I was waiting outside, listening, I was nervous. I didn't have any idea what she would say about me. But no, I'm not nervous now. This is, the reception is
very friendly crowd.
Yeah, put me at ease.
I gather that you're a big reader.
Well, yes, I am.
And how did that happen?
I'm taken aback. Are you insinuating that a Georgian?
No. I think you're insinuating an insinuation. No, my insinuation is far, I think, more odious, that Americans in general don't read.
Oh, well, I read 2 or 3 books a week, but I've always done this. My mother was a voracious reader. Amy's the most I've ever known. Amy reads all the time. If you saw Amy on the street right now, she would have a satchel with 2 or 3 books in it. She used to read at the state banquets at the White House, and was a fan for that. But my mother read, and our family have always read during mealtime, which some people find to be very rude. But when I was 7 or 8 years old, I hate to admit this because it's not a macho thing to say, my normal request at Christmas was that Santa Claus bring me books, and so I've got a voluminous library and read a lot and enjoy it. It's expanded my life, and now I hope we're going to eventually get around to the fact that I also write books.
Yes, indeed. In fact, if I may, I would like to hold up the object in question here. This is a wonderful book. It took me quite by surprise. It's called The Turning Point, and it's about President Carter's first induction into politics in 1962 in Georgia, his first state Senate race. And it's a very nice evocation of life in Georgia and all he went through. In fact, maybe this is the proper moment to ask if you might just read a very short passage for everybody.
Sure.
Shall I be the one to choose?
Yeah, I don't want to choose.
All right. I'll let me choose page 22 here.
Okay. Can I borrow your glasses? I didn't bring my glasses.
Certainly can. This is real teamwork.
Can I say just a word first?
Yes. Please do.
This book, Turning Point.
Don't break them or we'll both be lost.
It's about a turning point in my life because it's when I ran for office and the ballot box was stuffed against me, and almost every election law in Georgia was broken. And it's also a turning point in the history of our nation because this is the year that the so-called one-man, one-vote ruling was handed down. And it was the most significant decision made that brought about an end to racial segregation or race discrimination in the South. And this book is about how that took place and how the South had been able for more than 100 years after the war between the states of the Civil War to perpetuate racism and how torturous it was for us to end that self-abasing policy. And so the book is about 2 things, a turning point in my life and a turning point in the history of our country. I might also point out that it was not just the South that had had the need for the one-man, one-vote ruling. There were 31 other states in addition to Tennessee where the ruling took place where this afflicted us. I might point out, too, that in the county where this crime against me took place in the election, one vote in Quitman County, Georgia, a little small county, equaled 99 votes in Atlanta. And this was completely legal in the country then. I haven't been forewarned about what I'm going to read. One afternoon, a few days after the constable's second visit to me about the Citizens Council, I looked up from sacking wheat seed to see about 20 of my best customers coming in the front door of our warehouse. The spokesman was Paul Toms, a good friend with whom I had frequently been hunting at night for raccoons and possums. Paul was embarrassed, and so was I. He said, "Jimmy, we've come here to help with your business." "In what way, Paul?" I asked. he replied, "You know how much we thought of Mr. Earl." No, that was my father. "And we think almost as much of you as we did your daddy. He was one of us, and we always knew where he stood on some of the important things." I knew very well what he was talking about, but I asked him anyway. "Mr. Mark, the constable, says he's been to see you a couple of times about the White Citizens Council, but you don't seem to understand what it is. You're the only man in town that hasn't joined up, and we'd like to explain what we're trying to do. We're not out to hurt anybody, black or white, but we want to preserve our way of life." I considered the situation for a few moments and finally said, "I know all of you are friends of my family and mean the best for us, but I do not intend to join the White Citizens Council. This isn't the way I think we ought to go, and besides, there are a few politicians in Atlanta who are taking the dues from all over the state and putting the money in their pockets just because folks are worried about the race issue. I've made up my mind not to do it." One of the men said, "We heard you said the same thing when Mr. Mark came around to see you, so we've got the $5 here to pay your dues." This was a new development which pushed me into a corner. I finally got desperate or mad, for I abandoned the polite approach, got a $5 bill out of the cash register, and said, "I'll take this and flush it down the toilet, but I'm not going to join the White Citizens Council." The group made some comments about being sorry about my attitude as they left. We lost quite a few customers for several months, but eventually most of them came back.
At one point, and I'm just trying to, you probably know the sign that was put on your peanut warehouse door, I think around this time, that said something to the effect of "Coons and Carter go together." Wondering how somebody like yourself, who had a father who was a segregationist, finally came to the position that you did. Not an easy position to come to, given the climate in which the area in which you lived.
Well, my mother was always about the only white person in the Plains community that paid no attention to the segregation customs. She was a registered nurse. During the Depression, she acted like a doctor because many of the people didn't have any cash money at all. And she nursed them without regard to race. And she, planted this seed in my mind. And then I was in the Navy for 11 years, and I was a submarine officer when Harry Truman issued an edict that there would be no more racial discrimination in the military forces. And I personally saw the benefit of that ruling in my own life on a submarine where everyone depends on each other in a time of crisis to preserve the integrity of the ship and our own lives. And so when I came home from the Navy, I had been working for Admiral Rickover. I was one of the few people in the world who was, at that time, an expert on atomic power plants. I was in charge of the crew that built the second atomic submarine. But I came home when my father died and took over our small business, and I had a kind of an insurance policy because if Rosa and I had been forced to leave Plains because of the race issue, I could have gotten a job back with General Dynamics, because of my background in the Navy, that would have been quite lucrative compared to the money I was making. And the South was changing. We had I was a deacon, still am a deacon in our Baptist church in Plains, and I was gone one Sunday to a niece's wedding north of Atlanta. While I was gone, the deacons voted not to admit black people to worship in our church. And I came back the next Sunday, and we had a church conference. This is typical in a Baptist church. Everybody votes on each issue, and each church is independent. And I got up and made a speech that I didn't think that Christ wanted to discriminate against people because of race, that we should admit anyone to our church. And ordinarily we had about 50 people in the church conference. There were 250 people there that day because of the issue. And then we had to vote, and the vote was 50-6. 5 of the six were my family. And one was a man, a segregationist in the choir named Mr. Homer Harris, but he was deaf. And but the point was that 200 people didn't vote, which was a real indication of the changing attitude toward the race issue in Plains, Georgia, in that time. And then we had 200 school boards in Georgia. Not a single one of them defied the Supreme Court of the United States when it ruled that the schools had to be integrated, quite contrary to what did take place in Alabama and Mississippi and other states. So there were changing times, and once people saw it and advantages of it, they came around.
How do you, with this experience, perceive the whole issue now of gays in the military that President Clinton is having to deal with?
Well, I think he's made the right decision to do this. I don't want to be... I think it's long overdue, and I would not want my next remark to be interpreted as critical of him, but I had a similar issue in its emotional character when I was inaugurated, and that was concerning the people that were stigmatized as draft dodgers who had left this country by the tens of thousands and gone to Canada during the Vietnam War, and the same people basically were against them coming back into the United States except as criminals to be tried. When I took the oath of office at the Capitol, even before I walked down Pennsylvania Avenue, I went inside and signed a directive giving total amnesty to all young men in Canada and other countries. and it was over. Nobody could reverse my directive. I think had President Clinton issued a directive, 30 minutes or an hour after he was inaugurated, saying that there would never again be any prohibition of people going into the military because of their sexual preference, and no one would ever be discharged because of their sexual preference, it would have been a moot question as far as the basic issue. There would still be some legalities to handle later on, but it would have been over with. And I think, in retrospect, he probably wishes that he had done it instead of having a 6-month debate, but it's long overdue, and I hope he'll be persistent in carrying out his decision.
If I may just switch gears a bit here. You are an incredibly sincere and earnest man, and I think many people have been greatly inspired by that. But it also raises the question, after all, even St. Augustine had a dark side. And I'm wondering, where is the dark side?
Well, it's revealed every now and then. If you, well, I'll give you one example. I was in. This is my 4th day on the book trail. My first day was in Boston, near Harvard University, at a bookstore, and a large crowd came through. And one very nice young woman came up with the crowd listening attentively, and she said, "Mr. President, if you still have lust in your heart, I'm available."
I read about this.
So it's hard to realize that going back to 1976, that one phrase in almost cost me the election.
Yeah.
After it came out, I lost 15 percentage points in about a week. But now that would be nothing compared to what goes on these days. I just came along 15 years too early. I could have gotten away with a lot more.
I remember that was Bob Scheer in that Playboy interview, and I remember when that came out. And I remember wondering if, the reason why people didn't latch onto it so was because there was maybe some perverse human instinct to besmirch a clean surface. And it occurs to me that I'd like to ask you, whether you think in any way your earnestness perhaps also cost you the election. I mean, we're dealing with
1980s.
A strange question here of
I don't think so. I don't believe that was it. I've already told you what I believe. The people were so frustrated with the hostages having been kept so long. And in fact, as fate would have it, November the 4th, 1980 was the 1-year anniversary exactly of the hostages having been taken. And so instead of all the news magazines and all the newspapers concentrating on the election, they all concentrated on the fact that this was the anniversary of the hostages being taken. So I think the hostage issue was an overriding issue, and the divided Democratic Party. What people don't realize or don't remember, because of the subsequent propaganda, is that President Reagan got less than 51.5% in the vote that year, and the Republicans still talk about a groundswell of support and a mandate and so forth, but it was less than 51%. But the Democratic Party was split. And so that was the second thing that I think was devastating. I don't think it was because I was sincere and all.
Might you take any secret succor in the fact that President Bush was bitten by the economy in Iran, just as in a way you were, but somewhat slightly different?
Well, I think if I took pleasure out of that, it would reveal the black side of my character.
Go on. You've written that your most vivid impression of being president was what you called the loneliness in which most decisions are made.
Well, that's true. I personally preferred to run the White House similar to what Franklin Roosevelt did in this respect. I really preferred to have people around me who had different opinions about things. And the most vivid example was in the field of foreign policy with Brzezinski and Cyrus Vance. They were quite different, but very respected men, very knowledgeable men, and very forceful people. And then I made the final decision. But I like to participate with written memoranda and with the presentation to me of a multiple set of options, and then narrow those down and finally make the decision. And that final decision is a lonely one, particularly, I guess, if you don't have a group of homogeneous sycophants surrounding you, all of them telling you the same thing and exactly what they think you want to hear. So it does make it lonelier if you have to make the final decision. When I decided, for instance, to go to Camp David, this was one of the most controversial issues that I ever faced, because many people thought it was a very dangerous thing for a president to go into seclusion with two leaders when failure was most likely. And 6 months later, people don't remember this in history, when I decided to fly to Egypt and Israel to try to consummate the treaty between Israel and Egypt, it almost split my cabinet and my White House staff severely.
They figured it was a bad.
They thought it was doomed to failure, and I would be gauche or very vulnerable as a world statesman representing the integrity of my country if I went over and as a supplicant and was rejected by either Sadat or Begin when the whole world's focusing on whether I would succeed or not. So a lot of those things were controversial, and I guess the most difficult and controversial political issue I've ever faced, more difficult than even in getting elected president, was getting the Panama Canal Treaty ratified by 2/3 of the members of the U.S. Senate. And the failure there, I think, would have resulted in an almost immediate destruction of the Panama Canal itself. So those and normalizing relations with China was not a pleasant thing to do. You know, the so-called Taiwan lobby was so powerful in this country back then that although previous presidents, President Nixon was interested in China, obviously went to China in 1972 and had the Shanghai Communique, and one of the credible things that he did during his administration, among many others, was issuing an agreement with the Chinese leaders that there was only one China. He didn't say which one, but
to be decided.
So it was a lonely thing for me to say which one later on, yeah. But I don't mean to imply that it was an unpleasant job. I look forward to getting up early every morning and getting to the White House every day. I never dreaded getting to the Oval Office every day. Sometimes I was disappointed when I got there, but I still look forward to it ahead of time.
I think one of your periodic disappointments might have been the press, which you had a fairly rocky relationship with. And I'm curious to know what you envisioned the role of the press should be, and where you really felt the wheel really stuck between you and them. I mean, what went on there?
There was a professor, I think at the University of Indiana, who did an analysis that was published in the Presidential Quarterly. There's a magazine with that name a few years ago, and it showed that in this century I was treated most negatively by the press than any other president, including President Nixon even, during Watergate. Out of the 48 months that I was in office, I only had favorable press treatment the first month, and that was primarily because I walked down the Pennsylvania Avenue. But I
and
never
then you got criticized for that.
No, that was favorable, but after that that was the first day it went downhill from there. But I never have understood why exactly that occurred. I think part of it was because as I mentioned earlier, I told the people I would never lie to them, and it was like an oath for me. And I think the press always wanted to show that somehow or another they could catch me in some sort of lie. And the fact that Watergate had made heroes out of investigative reporters, I think they thought that if they looked deeply enough in my closet or in my cabinet closet, they would find scandals. Another factor was that I was unknown. I had never served in Washington. I was a Southerner. I was the first Southerner. I was the first person from the Deep South who had served in the White House in more than 130 years, since the 1840s, early 1840s. I was known to be a religious person, a Baptist. So there were a lot of things. The cumulative effect of those, I think, made the press very skeptical about things that I was trying to do.
You mentioned
but I might add quickly, I wouldn't want to change. I wouldn't want any sort of restraints to be put on the press. Mm-hmm. I think they ought to be totally free to approve or criticize, sure.
Even when they're annoying?
Oh, sure. Well, even when they were annoying, yes. I enjoyed the White House press conferences. I look forward to them. It was kind of a give and take proposition, and that was better to have me on television with the words coming out of my own mouth, rather than in the evening news to have my mouth moving and Sam Donaldson telling the American people what he thought I said.
I suppose it would be unfair to ask you what particular thorns you felt were in your side at the time, so I won't.
Thank you.
In your inaugural address, you said that our commitment to human rights must be absolute. Now, that's a very absolute statement, one which certainly has not been borne out by many presidents since. Did you find that, particularly, in relation to China, for instance, when we recognized China, as I recall, there were relatively few statements about Chinese human rights abuses, and I'm kind of curious to know what was in your mind at the time that China was recognized, how you thought we would deal with this impasse.
Well, as you know, that's a very complicated subject, and I think our commitment to human rights can be as absolute as our commitment to freedom, or to honesty, or to justice, or to truth. But at the same time, human rights as a factor cannot be the only factor involved in our relationship with other nations. There's a very complicated definition of human rights. Every year I make an annual human rights address, and I take a different aspect of human rights and talk about it on the anniversary of the Universal Human Rights Declaration. Our definition of human rights, which we take for granted almost like breathing, is totally different from the definition of human rights in other countries. I used to argue with the Russian ambassador Dobrynin and with the foreign minister Gromyko, and in person with Brezhnev, about human rights. As far as we're concerned, human rights means the extracts from the Bill of Rights: freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of trial by jury, freedom of speech. That's not the definition of human rights in many other countries. They would point out to me, we think that it's a human right for everyone to have a home. And you have 50,000 people sleeping on the street in New York City. We think it's a human right for a person to have a job. And the average in our country for the last 20 years is like 7 million Americans who are without jobs. And they would claim we think it's a human right for everyone to have medical care. In our country, we've got probably 35 million Americans that don't have medical care. So how do you define human rights? And so when I said that human rights, dedication to human rights is absolute, it doesn't mean that it was the only factor involved. And I've learned a lot about human rights since I left the White House. But that was every ambassador who served our country when I was president was my personal human rights representative. Every embassy of the United States in the world was a haven for people who suffered human rights abuses from their own leaders. And I got reports about every leader who came to see me, and they knew it was on the agenda. And my relationship with that person and the nation's relationship to the United States, to some degree, was affected by their human rights policy. So that's what I meant by making it absolute. It was a foundation for our foreign policy, but it couldn't be the only factor. Because in some cases, like normalizing with China, we could keep China isolated. A question is China more amenable to adopting some of the Western standards for human rights since they've opened themselves up to the Western world and to our influence than they were before? When I normalized relations with China, the first thing I did was send over Frank Press, who's now the president of the American Academy of Sciences, who was my science advisor, to open up exchange programs for Chinese students to come to our colleges. And Deng Xiaoping said, can we send as many as 500? And Frank Press said, yes, I have authority to tell you that. And Deng Xiaoping said, I don't want your authority. I want to know from President Carter. And so he insisted, and finally Frank Press sent me a strange telegram, said, I need, in writing from you, approval for Chinese students. Well, you know, we eventually got up to more than 100,000 Chinese students. My belief is that it's better to have 100,000 Chinese students coming over here and going back home, even though China is guilty of human rights violations, than it is just to close the door and say, okay, you know, we don't want to have anything to do with China because you have some human rights standards that don't match our own. I'm very concerned about human rights abuses in China. And that, since I've become a kind of a hero in China, since we did normalize relations since I was president, whenever I write to Chinese leaders about a particular person that's been arrested and abused student demonstrators, almost invariably that person is treated well or released. They don't do it in response to my inquiry, but they let me know a few weeks later, a few months later, that person has been released. So I think our influence in China and other countries where human rights abuses take place is better if we have relations with that country. One of the first things I did when I went into office in March was to open up travel to any nation in the world, to any American citizen. I wish that Bill Clinton would do that now. Let any American that wants to, let us go to Cuba. Let us go to North Korea. So that's a subject that's very complicated, and I don't know all the answers, obviously, but I think we ought to search for ways to implement human rights and not be narrowly restrictive in our definition of it.
There's so much to ask you, and time is waning. If I may, maybe we'll jump down to President Reagan.
Okay.
You spoke of your defeat by Reagan as an incomprehensible defeat, and you said that you were appalled at his position on several issues and called some of his economic notions ridiculous. And I'm wondering, in balance, how you perceived the Reagan tenure, and if at times you found it hard to just hold your tongue.
Well, yes, I had a hard time holding my tongue, but you have to realize that a former president who was defeated doesn't have much of a bully pulpit. and even if I had released my tongue, not many people would have heard what I had to say. But I have a lot more equanimity now about President Reagan since he and President Bush are out of office and the Democrats back in the White House.
This does work wonders, doesn't it?
Yeah, it heals wounds. But I think the most lasting detrimental factor will be the enormous budget deficit and national debt that's been piled on our country in the last 12 years. All the way from George Washington through me, the total accumulated debt was less than $1 trillion. And in President Reagan's 8 years, he tripled that debt. And the rate of increase has been even greater under President Bush. And so now the country is saddled with an extraordinary debt that's almost uncontrollable. I don't know what Bill Clinton will do about it. I hope he'll be courageous enough to proceed. And that has meant that when I left office, we were the greatest creditor nation on earth. We are now the greatest debtor nation on earth. We owe foreigners more money than all the third world countries in the world combined. And our debt to foreigners is increasing at a very rapid rate. So I think that legacy will be the most permanently damaging. And I say this without any personal animosity at all, but just in an analytical way. I think that's the thing that was done that's quite contrary to what the Republican Party reputation had been before that, was to reduce deficit spending and so forth. I think that he reversed that trend.
To conserve, as in conservative.
That's exactly right.
What do you ascribe his enormous popularity? Was that
surprising to me? Yes. I think President Reagan had a remarkable facility, first of all, of not being blamed for anything that went wrong. And I don't mean that he did this deliberately, but his demeanor was such that other people always were guilty of something that didn't go right or wasn't popular. Also, President Reagan had the remarkable ability, which is quite admirable in a politician, of convincing the American people everything's okay. We don't need to worry about energy. We don't need to worry about forests being decimated. We don't need to worry about the federal debt growing. We don't need to worry about this and that. And I think that American people like to be soothed and convinced that everything is all right. That's another factor involved. And I think he had a very clear philosophy that was not never did deviate too much. And that kind of single-minded commitment to a certain philosophy that he espoused from the very beginning to the end gave him an image of strength. He didn't equivocate. He was not torn about where to go on this or that. And I think that single-minded purpose was attractive. So he went out of office quite popular, and I understand some of the reasons for it. Now I think since I built houses and so forth, my popularity has gotten up about equal to his. But while he was in office, he maintained that popularity, and I think had there not been a constitutional restriction, he would have been reelected for a third term.
I gather that when you left the White House and went back to Plains, it was a really difficult time for you to readjust and to absorb the notion of defeat. And I wonder what you think, how easy a job you think President Bush will have with this same challenge.
Well, you have to remember that presidents are just as individualistic as the average person. We are not cut out of the same mold, and we leave office with different standards and motivations and interests and age and everything else. A couple of weeks after President Bush was defeated, after I felt that the wounds had healed, I wrote him a personal note and invited him to come by the Carter Center to look at our presidential library to see how we built it and to talk to me about how we raised the money and dealt with architects and that sort of thing, and also to look at some of the programs we have at the Carter Center, which are quite extensive. And he wrote me a very nice note back thanking me for the invitation. He's never been there to our center yet. But I think he'll come, and I would welcome him there. I've had a very harmonious relationship since I left the White House with President Ford. I've been to his library 3 times. He's been to my library 5 or 6 times. And we've cooperated on some major issues that our center addresses. And I would like to do the same thing with President Bush, particularly dealing with some maybe international issues. We have 26 major health programs at the Carter Center. We have programs in more than 25 African countries in food production and immunization of children, and negotiating for ceasefires and to hold elections. And we have 150,000 African farmers in a program to help them increase their production of food grains. These are the kinds of things that we are able to do, and a number of those issues would be very greatly assisted if President Bush decided to join me in them, or if he had an initiative of his own. I would be honored to join him as a partner if that was appropriate.
What have you made of the whole Hillary Clinton brouhaha? I mean, Rosalind was very much involved in your tenure, attended cabinet meetings. Do you think this is another tempest in a teapot that will pass?
I think it's just a tempest with the press. You know, I don't think the American people expect an active and competent and highly educated woman like Hillary Clinton to go up to the White House and hide herself in a room somewhere. I think they expect her to be a dynamic force. And they made this very clear during the campaign. I think that nowadays people look on the First Lady with the same degree of esteem and expectation that they look on the Vice President. It's a partnership that's going to be used in duality for the benefit of the country. Rosalind was the preeminent leader then and still is now on mental health in this country. And when I had a difficult problem in a Latin American nation and I couldn't leave this country myself, I had no trepidation about sending Rosalind down to talk about matters of great substance. I remember once, for instance, she went to 7 Latin American countries. One of them was Brazil. President Geisel down there with the military leadership was purifying uranium with the expectation of making nuclear weapons. And Argentina was doing the same thing. They were having a race to see who could do it. Rosalind went down and talked to Geisel about it. And the Peruvian junta, 5 military leaders, were spending an extraordinary amount of their total budget on weapons, and she talked to them about the adverse effect of that. So she talked about substantive things, and obviously the First Lady performs a lot of ceremonial activities as well. Rosalind has, I think that Hillary Clinton will bring a good deal of stature and background and obviously intimacy with and support of the President to the bill was putting her in charge of the health project. I think it'll puts a lot of pressure on both of them, because if she fails, it's going to be a direct reflection on him. But I think this is a very good thing, and nowadays it's expected. I don't think the American people were surprised at all.
Do you have any words of cautionary words for President Clinton? Any salutations?
You mean tonight? No.
Tonight. Now.
No.
Have you met with him in the last...
Well, I was at the inauguration and talked to him. And Rosa and I really supported Bill Clinton from the beginning, although we don't let our views be known during the Democratic primary season. Both of us were for Bill. He knew it during the Democratic primary. And I've known Bill Clinton for 15 years, very favorably. I knew him when he was Attorney General. I knew him when I was governor, when I was president, when he was governor. Have a great deal of respect for him. And during the campaign, he consulted with me on occasion, and even after the election several times. And I presume he'll continue to do so. A couple of weeks, the week before the inauguration, Al Gore called me to say that he would like to be in charge of the Clinton administration in dealing with the Atlanta project. The Atlanta project is a special deal that we have to try to address the problems of the inner cities of this country. And we're working very closely with the Rebuild L.A. and other things, Los Angeles and so forth. So I have a good relationship with the Clinton administration. But they don't need my public admonitions or advice, I don't think.
Well, as long as they get them in private.
Yeah.
I think what we'll do now is maybe go on to a few questions we've gotten from the audience. But before we do that, let me tell all of you that when we end shortly, those of you who would like to buy a copy of Turning Point can do so outside, and President Carter will return to the stage to sign them. So if you care to, you can come back and he will do that. We thought we'd do a few questions from the floor.
All right.
Do you think our problems are so far beyond solving that no president can make a real difference, and thus we will, in the foreseeable future, have a succession of one-term presidents?
No, I don't think so. I believe that the main issue that might measure the effectiveness of the Clinton administration would be health care. If this year he and the Congress can evolve a new program for providing health care for Americans that is accepted as an improvement, a substantial improvement, I think that would almost be enough achievement for the first 4 years, particularly if he could keep our nation at peace and put forward, high moral standards and not be embarrassed with some sort of scandal. So I don't think that they are so intransigent that we can't deal with them. I personally have deplored our country's not giving enough attention to environmental issues and to peace and human rights. And I don't really have any doubt that Clinton and Gore together will be champions of environmental issues and human rights. My hope is that they'll use diplomacy and preventive measures to deal with crises around the world rather than injection of troops. I don't know if that's going to be the case, but I hope so. So I think that Bill Clinton can achieve for himself an adequate degree of popularity in this first term to be reelected.
You mentioned the question of troops being sent abroad. This question asks, do you believe that the U.S. government should wait for the Europeans to make the first move in intervening in former Yugoslavia?
Well, there are two phases there. I think that the United States should play the leading role in the United Nations in bringing this issue to the Security Council in an extremely forceful way, using a substantial portion of the influence and prestige and persuasion that we did to initiate the Gulf War. But as far as the actual troops and the airplanes to be used in what was Yugoslavia, I would prefer that the Europeans be in the forefront. We've been in the forefront in Somalia. We've been in the forefront in the Gulf War. Let them be in the forefront now, but I think we ought not to lag back and let this issue continue to fester. So if we are the driving force in the Security Council to get action, with the Europeans providing their troops and airplanes in the forefront, I think that's what my preference would be.
How do you avoid becoming cynical about the world condition? How do you continue to find the energy to work?
Well, I see a lot of success stories, and at the Carter Center, for instance, we have what's called the Task Force on Child Survival, responsible for the immunization of all the world's children against polio, measles, diphtheria, typhoid, whooping cough, and the prevention of diarrhea. In just 5 years, from up until 1991, we increased from 20% to 80% the number of children in the third world that were immunized. That's a wonderful success story. And just this afternoon, I finished writing an op-ed piece about Audrey Hepburn, who was one of the driving forces behind that program. It was UNICEF and others. We coordinated from the Carter Center. We have another task force on disease eradication. It was 15 years ago that the only disease ever was eradicated. That was smallpox. And now we formed a task force, and we've identified 2 more diseases to be eradicated. One is well known in this country, it's polio. And we expect to have it eradicated by the year 2000. The audience might be interested in knowing that we'll never have another case of polio in this hemisphere. We had our last case of polio in Peru last year. We never expect to have another case of polio in Latin America, the Caribbean, Central America, or here. But it's going to take us a while in Asia. The other disease is guinea worm, and the Carter Center is personally responsible for the eradication of guinea worm, which is a horrible disease. We'll do that by 1996. We build houses for people. Rosen and I go with volunteers every year just for a week, and we sometimes work a few extra days a year, and we start homes Monday morning from scratch, from just a foundation. And Friday at noon, we move the family into a brand new house with carpets and drapes and so forth. But they have to, the family has to put in 500 hours of work on their own house. They have to pay for the house. We charge them full price for the house, but zero interest. We go back to those houses. We've been doing it now for this will be the 11th year. I've never seen one of those houses with a broken window pane or a mark of graffiti or an unmowed lawn. It transforms the whole neighborhood. And families that have never finished high school in 3 generations, they move into a decent home, which they themselves help to build. In 2 weeks, they're deciding which college their kids will attend. It's a transforming experience. So this is the kind of thing we do. We monitor every day all the conflicts in the world. There are about 110 of them this month. 32 of them are major wars within which more than 1,000 people have been killed. Almost all of those wars, 30 of them are civil wars just within countries. They're horrendous in scope. More than 1 million people were killed in Ethiopia. 225,000 were killed in Sudan in 1 year. We hardly know about them. The problem is that in a civil war, the United Nations cannot address those wars, and it's improper for either a U.S. ambassador or a UN official to communicate with revolutionaries who are trying to overthrow a government that's a member of the UN. So the Carter Center goes in. I go in and meet freely with the revolutionaries and meet with the government and find them very eager to try to work something out. We can't negotiate peace very much, but we can hold a democratic election because both sides believe they will win an election. Since politics is a science of self-delusion. So the point is that there are hopeful things around the world, if they can be marshaled, but there needs to be a combination of private organizations and individuals working on an issue side by side with the governments. And that hasn't yet been done. And quite often our government agencies don't even cooperate with each other. So I don't have a sense of hopelessness. I have a sense of frustration sometimes, but it's a challenge. And the things that we do are not sacrifices. It's interesting and exciting and challenging and unpredictable and adventurous and sometimes gratifying. So I don't get too skeptical about the future.
This person asks you, do you ever get letters from Reagan Democrats apologizing for having voted Republican in 1980?
Yes, a few.
During the last 12 years of Republican administrations, the country has become increasingly divided along racial lines. What would you advise Bill Clinton to prescribe to alleviate our racial divisions?
Well, I think he's made a major step forward already in some of his appointments. I think his public statements. I think he's inclined to take up again the banner of human rights abroad and civil rights at home, which I think is encouraging. And the president's words themselves, absent any specific actions, can be a very major factor in alleviating tension. One of the things that Rosen said, I remember on 60 Minutes, was that, I won't call the president's name, but said he made us comfortable with our prejudices. We need to be aware that we are prejudiced on occasion. But the biggest discrimination in the world now is not white against black or racial. It's not even religious. It's the discrimination of rich people against poor people. And this is something that we don't want to acknowledge. And by rich people, I'm not talking about the size of a bank account. But a rich person is a person that's got a decent house, or that has some education, or has a prospect of a job, or a moderate amount of health care, or who lives in a neighborhood where they can walk outside the house without being afraid, or who believe that the police and the judicial system is on my side and not against me, or who think that if I make a decision, it'll make a difference, if not anything else in my own life. Those are rich people. But a lot of our neighbors in Atlanta and in San Francisco, Los Angeles, don't have any of those things, and we hardly know them. You know, how many poor people do we actually know? Well enough to go into their kitchen and have a cup of coffee, or know the names of their teenage sons, or, God forbid, invite them to our house to have a cup of coffee. You know, we don't even know them. And they are increasingly afflicted in this great country. Let me give you a couple of statistics. I haven't given any statistics tonight. In Atlanta, which is a good city, it's always had good race relations, comparatively speaking, and it's got the Olympics coming and got the best baseball team in the United States, things like that. But Atlanta, there are two Atlantas. And in the last 5 years alone, listen to this, last 5 years alone, there's been a 300% increase in crimes of violence in the juvenile courts, a 1,700% increase in 5 years in drug-related crimes. In Washington, D.C., there's been a 750% increase in homicides among young people. That's just in the last 5 years. When I went to the White House, when I left the White House, there were 1,200 homeless people in Atlanta. There are now 15,000 homeless people in Atlanta. So things are getting worse. And the reason is that people like you and me, and I guess almost everyone in this audience, we don't really know anybody that's in genuine need that doesn't have a home and no prospect of a job, or whose girls get pregnant and don't get prenatal care. We don't even know them. And so that's the purpose of the Atlanta Project. I write about it in this book to some degree. But it's a challenge for us, but it's not something that should turn us away. It's not a challenge that should force us into an ivory tower. It should open our hearts to reach out in a very exciting way to people that are highly receptive to friendship and to care and to understanding, partnership. We see this to some degree in the Habitat home building thing, but it could apply in almost every aspect of life. I don't think it's a hopeless case.
This person asks, what was the greatest joy for you of being president?
Well, the happiest moment of my life while I was president came right after I went out of office. I had stayed up. I went to bed Saturday night at Camp David, and from then all the way through Saturday and Sunday and Monday and Tuesday morning, I never went to bed, trying to negotiate the release of the American hostages. And at 10 o'clock on inauguration morning, when President Reagan was going to take office, I was informed that all the hostages were safe and were in an airplane ready to take off from the airport in Tehran. And I was waiting to hear that they had cleared Iran. And just about 10 minutes after President Reagan, well, actually, as soon as President Reagan finished his inaugural speech, I was leaving the inauguration platform, and I was informed by the Secret Service, who've been listening on the radio, that all the hostages were safe and free. That was the happiest moment that I recall. But I had some other happy moments. Obviously, when we got the Camp David Accords, that was a good moment, and when the Panama Canal Treaty passed, and when we got the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, that was a happy time. So there were a lot of good times when I was president. We had a very fine family relationship in the White House. Our youngest son was going to college in Washington, and Amy was in elementary school, and Rosen was my partner. So it was a good time.
Well, on that positive note, I think we'll say adieu, and thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thank you. Thanks.
been listening to a KQED radio special broadcast, a conversation with Jimmy Carter, presented by City Arts and Lectures, live from Masonic Auditorium in San Francisco. The production engineer for this program is Joe Hunter. For KQED Radio, I'm Sally Isley.